Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the belief that everyone has, and the Tories are leaning heavily on, that come the general election being announced, the polls will narrow and the eventual result will be very different from what polls are saying now. And this may indeed be the case. However, in order to get a clear sight on what is realistically possible, it's important to look more carefully at what the polls are saying now, as well as what they have said in the past. Because people have an awful lot of false memories about what's come before. So before I go over why the polls may not narrow this time, or if they do, not by much, I want to take a look at 1992. This is the Conservatives' happy place. It's the election they're trying to replicate. Oh, Labour on course for victory, and we pulled it out the bag and won 5 more years in power, the Tories say. Only, it's not quite true, is it? It's commonly believed, that I remember at the time, I was 15 at the time, very interested in politics, but not digging into the data. I got all my information from the mainstream media mostly. And I certainly had the impression that Labour were on course for victory, and then it didn't happen. It was all very surprising. There were reports of the spiral of silence that followed. Polling was conducted face-to-face then. Internet use was not common. And at the time, Ipsos did later change to more telephone polling, but at the time it was all face-to-face. It was felt that people couldn't bring themselves to tell the pollster, even though it was anonymous, but they're sat right next to them. They couldn't say to their face, oh yeah, I've got to vote Conservative, but they did anyway. So a weakness in the polling was exposed. But, it created this belief that Labour on course for victory, but it had as much to do with the media not quite providing a few details than it was the pollsters. Because let's look at what really happened. To get a good handle, we need to know when the election's going to be. The problem is that we don't. However, there are now 2 likely windows. The first is in June, should Sunak face a major rebellion after the local elections and calls the general election in response. The second is in autumn, possibly late October, possibly early November. So if we assume the first window, then we're maybe 2.5 months from the election. Back in 1992, 2.5 months before the election, the Conservatives were 3 points ahead of Labour. So it was not really possible to believe that Labour had this really long run-up at a win if you were paying attention to the polls, which the media obviously weren't. But then let's say it's the second window. So let's say we're now about 7 months away from the election. That would be early September back in 1991. Start of September, the Conservatives were 2 points ahead. Now, in both cases, the polling was tight, but the Conservatives had a lead at both of the same possible distances or likely distances from the election that we are now. Labour did establish leads in between those times in 2 particular periods. There was a decent one, in fact, it was the only decent one, over the autumn of 1991. So if the Tories are to learn anything from 1992 election, it is this. First, if they think Labour were on course for a win and then a brilliant Conservative campaign won it, they are deluding themselves. Second, the Labour opposition gained their most support during autumn, as the Tory NHS winter crisis was kicking in and people were counting the cost of living. Are they really sure they want to hold the election this autumn? But there really is no precedent for snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. It's based on false memories and a bit of a weakness in the polling in 1992. Because I will point out, Labour did establish a second period of lead, and it was during that general election campaign itself. In fact, they led throughout it. This was the narrowing of the polls. Election was called, all of a sudden people said they would vote Labour. Then on the day, the polls were well out as that narrow lead for Labour turned into a significant lead for the Conservatives. But that was that polling weakness exposed. People had effectively been lying to the pollsters. But in the run-up to the election, from the position we're in now, there was no polling saying Labour would win. Remember that Labour always need a fairly sizable lead to get a majority as well, because they win so many seats by large margins, whereas the Conservatives tend to have more efficient votes spread across more constituencies. But then there's this issue of the polls narrowing. Now, we do often find polls narrowing during a general election campaign. Not only are the campaign messages getting to voters who don't normally pay attention to politics, and of course, you wouldn't spend that much money on general election campaigns if they didn't work to persuade people, but also the way people think about elections changes. Before an election is called, like if people are responding to a poll now, it's sort of hypothetical. So people may respond more instinctively. Once the election is called, it sort of focuses the mind. People are now thinking how they want to use their vote for real because it's now going to have an impact. And this often favours the incumbent government as people get cold feet over the prospect of a largely untested alternative. But what sort of swings can we expect? Well, if we look at every general election which has taken place in my lifetime, which also coincidentally involves every general election for which Ipsos have polling data, then we can see that in the final roughly 6 weeks before the general election, you get an average of a 1.5 swing away from the incumbent government. Away from them. 1.5 points. Now, that's hardly setting the world on fire, whichever way it went. Of course, that figure is rendered partly meaningless because sometimes the poll swings towards the government and sometimes away. Given that the Tories want the polls to narrow in their favour this time, we could look at which years this happened and how applicable that is. But the greatest swing towards the government was in 1992. But as already mentioned, that was not a real swing towards them. It was chiefly down to that phenomenon of people being polled face to face, effectively lying to the pollsters out of shame for saying they would vote Conservative. But nonetheless, a 9-point swing towards them. Or we could look at 1997, where Major's government got an 8-point swing towards them, even though it was not enough. Maybe that's a better year to use. Because Labour at that point did have a long run-up at being on course for victory. They had a poll lead for a very long time, not just when the election was called. And it's almost exactly the same swing as in 1992. But polling had also learned and moved on. So 1997's a better year. Right now, with the latest Ipsos voting intention polls, those would show the Conservatives winning just 24 seats. So let's say they did manage an 8-point swing in their favour between now and election day. 8-point swing, just like in 1997. With other parties maintaining their sort of levels of support. The Conservatives would benefit by winning 103 seats. Oh, that's way better, but that's still a pounding. So what's the best the Conservatives can hope for? Well, if we look at history, in 2017, there was a 20-point swing over those last 6 weeks. Absolutely mental. Problem for the Tories is it was away from their own government as a result of Theresa May's hiding from voters, her advisers' incompetence, ranged against a Labour campaign which was calm and remained on message. So for this to happen, the Tories would need to hope that Starmer suddenly got scared of the public when he's been happily getting out and about up until now, and that Sunak's operation remained calm and on message, in direct contradiction to the available evidence. But let's just pretend. A 20-point narrowing of the polls, with other parties doing roughly as well, would mean the Conservatives winning 224 seats. Labour would get a modest majority of just 54. That is the best the Tories can hope for, but it is based on numerous things happening. First, Labour diverging from the calm and assured campaigns we've seen for locals and by-elections over the past couple of years. Second, that Keir Starmer personally develops a fear of voters. Third, that the Conservatives organise a coherent strategy and their MPs fall into line behind it and stay on message. Fourth, that Sunak doesn't say something stupid when being interviewed or talking to the public, unlike every single time he's done those things to date. And fifth, that Reform UK do not continue to siphon off Tory votes. None of these 5 factors are remotely realistic. The problem for the Tories is that they think polls narrowing is just a phenomenon, that it just happens. You always see it in elections. But they don't try to understand what causes it. They think it happens by magic. But the polls do not always move in favour of the incumbent during an election campaign. And they do not always narrow either. In 2001, and every single election from 2010 onwards, the polls have actually moved against the government. In 1983, 2010 and 2015, the poll gap also widened over the course of the campaign, not narrowed. So poll narrowing is not a phenomenon. It doesn't happen every election campaign. It's not even that there was this like one weird election campaign where it didn't happen. There's several where it didn't happen. It just happens that if the incumbent government is behind in the polls, there's a decent chance that during the election campaign, it'll narrow in their favour. But that doesn't mean to say it's always happened in the past. And it doesn't mean to say it'll happen now. You know, there's every reason to believe that the polls may narrow. The undecided Conservative voters will somehow think Labour are too scary, hold their nose and vote for the omnishambles in charge right now. It's also possible that tactical voting will reduce Labour's vote share in seats where a different party is best placed to challenge the Conservatives, and the poll gap narrows as Labour lose vote share as a result of that. But in that case, ironically, it will work against the Conservatives' interests. It would be vaguely hilarious to see them narrow the gap with Labour but lose even more seats because of it. But the point is, there is no reason to suppose the polls will narrow. It might be that undecided voters who aren't keen on Labour nonetheless agree that they represent a much better chance at positive change and vote Labour reluctantly or strategically. So any Tories thinking the polls will narrow, as if by magic, without them doing anything to prompt it, are just fooling themselves. And they may end up the day after the election with a very rude awakening. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.